There is a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. You can rest for 10 hours and still wake up depleted because the thing draining you isn't your body. It's a person. Maybe it's a phone call you're already dreading before it happens. Maybe it's the tightening in your chest the moment a certain name appears on your screen. Maybe it's the strange guilt you feel for even having this thought. Because, on paper, this person hasn't done anything you could point to in a courtroom. No single incident. Just 1,000 small ones, each too minor to justify the relief you feel when they cancel on you. If you've ever caught yourself feeling lighter the moment someone left the room, and then felt ashamed of that lightness, you already understand exactly what this is about. Even if you've spent years telling yourself it isn't that serious, we're taught to think of toxicity as something dramatic, screaming, betrayal, cruelty you could film and show a jury. But most toxic influence doesn't look like a crime. It looks like a slow erosion, a barely perceptible tax on your nervous system that gets paid every single time you're near a certain person. Until one day, you notice that an entire relationship, or an entire family dynamic, or an entire friendship you've had since childhood, has quietly become something you survive rather than something you enjoy. And here is the part almost nobody says out loud. You already know who these people are in your life. You knew before this video started. What you don't know is why removing them feels almost impossible. Even when every rational part of you agrees it should be simple. Carl Jung offers a starting point that most self-help content skips entirely, because it's uncomfortable in a very specific way. Jung didn't believe toxic relationships persisted purely because of the other person's behavior. He believed they persisted because something in you recognized something familiar in them. And that recognition, buried far below conscious awareness, made walking away feel like severing a limb rather than removing a splinter. Picture the version of you at 7 or 8 years old, watching a parent's mood shift the atmosphere of an entire house the moment they walked through the door. You learned, without anyone teaching you directly, to read a room in half a second, to anticipate irritation before it surfaced, to modulate your own voice, your own needs, your own presence, based on someone else's unpredictable internal weather. That skill kept you safe. It also became the invisible template your nervous system uses decades later to decide who feels like home. And this is the first uncomfortable truth. Many people don't accidentally end up entangled with difficult, draining, manipulative individuals. They are unconsciously drawn to the specific emotional frequency they spent their entire childhood learning to manage, but that isn't the real problem. The real problem is what this recognition does to your judgment once the relationship is already underway. Because familiarity and safety feel identical to a nervous system that was never taught the difference. Jung called the mechanism at work here projection, though it operates far more personally than the word suggests. When you interact with a toxic person, you are not only reacting to their actual behavior, you are reacting through a lens built from every unresolved dynamic you've carried since childhood. And they, often without even realizing it, are doing precisely the same thing to you. This is why the most damaging relationships rarely feel obviously wrong from the inside. They feel like intensity. They feel like chemistry. They feel, disturbingly often, like fate. The very features that should function as warning signs, the unpredictability, the way you never quite know which version of them you'll get, the subtle sense that you're always slightly on trial. Instead, register in the nervous system as familiar. And the brain has a well-documented tendency to mistake familiar for safe, even when familiar is precisely what hurt you the first time. Something even more dangerous is happening beneath the surface of this, though, and it explains why simply setting a boundary, the advice you've heard 100 times, so rarely works. Most people believe boundaries fail because the toxic person ignores them. That's only half true. The deeper issue is that many people who grew up managing someone else's emotional weather were never allowed to have boundaries in the first place. And a nervous system that has never practiced boundary setting doesn't simply acquire the skill because a book told it to. Think about the last time you tried to say no to someone who consistently drains you, and notice what actually happened in your body in the seconds before you spoke. The tightening throat, the sudden urge to soften the request with 3 unnecessary apologies, the instinct to over-explain yourself to a person who has never once extended you the same courtesy. That physical response isn't weakness. It's a trained reflex built in an environment where saying no once carried real consequences. And reflexes don't negotiate with logic. They only change through repetition, which is precisely why a single dramatic confrontation almost never works, and why people who attempt one often end up right back in the same dynamic within weeks, quietly convinced that they're simply bad at boundaries. When the truth is, they were never taught the muscle exists. This is where psychology becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because the conversation about toxic people almost always focuses entirely on the other person's behavior, and almost never on the specific psychological function that person is unconsciously serving in your life. Alfred Adler proposed that human beings are driven less by past causes and more by present goals. Applied here, the question becomes startling. What is staying connected to this person actually giving you, even as it exhausts you? For some people, the answer is a strange sense of purpose, the identity of being the fixer, the one who understands them, the one who won't give up. For others, it's a way of avoiding a harder truth. Adler's insight cuts through the sentimentality. You are rarely trapped by a toxic person alone. You are often trapped by the specific role. Their presence allows you to keep playing. Watch closely the next time a toxic relationship in your own life produces one of its brief, convincing improvements. The apology that finally sounds sincere. The single good week after months of chaos. Neuroscience offers a precise explanation for why that brief relief hits you so much harder than steady kindness ever could, and why it keeps you anchored long after logic says you should have left. This is the mechanism behind what researchers call intermittent reinforcement, a pattern in which reward arrives unpredictably rather than consistently. Slot machines are built on exactly this principle, and so, whether either person realizes it or not, are most toxic relationships. A brain receiving unpredictable rewards releases more dopamine, not less than a brain receiving steady, reliable ones, because uncertainty itself becomes part of the craving. This is why Walking away from someone consistently cruel is, counterintuitively, often easier than walking away from someone who is cruel and occasionally wonderful. Your nervous system isn't holding out for the wonderful version out of naivety. It's chemically hooked on the unpredictability itself, chasing the next unpredictable reward with the same neural circuitry involved in gambling addiction. Most people never notice what comes next because it doesn't announce itself as damage. It announces itself as personality. The longer you remain entangled with someone who consistently destabilizes you, the more your own baseline for normal quietly recalibrates. Chronic stress from an unpredictable relationship keeps the body's threat response system engaged far more often than it should be, and a nervous system living in a near constant state of low-grade alert eventually starts to interpret that state as simply who you are. You don't experience yourself as a calm person trapped in a stressful dynamic. You experience yourself as an anxious person, a person who overthinks, a person who's just sensitive, never realizing the anxiety was manufactured by proximity to someone specific and would likely dissolve the moment that proximity ended. This is one of the cruelest tricks toxic relationships play. They don't just hurt you, they quietly convince you the hurt is a personality trait rather than a symptom. Evolutionary psychology adds an uncomfortable layer to why this recalibration happens so easily. For most of human history, staying connected to a difficult member of your tribe was almost always safer than isolation, even when that member was unpredictable or occasionally cruel. A lone human on the ancient savannah didn't face a bad mood. They faced predators, starvation, and death with no one to share the burden. So the ancestral brain developed a strong, largely unconscious preference for known discomfort over unknown risk, a bias that made evolutionary sense for tens of thousands of years. And now, in a world where you can simply block a number and survive perfectly well, actively works against you. The dread of cutting someone off doesn't come from a rational assessment of your actual risk. It comes from a threat detection system still calibrated for a world that no longer exists. One where the tribe, however flawed, was always statistically safer than the wilderness beyond it. Two cognitive biases quietly reinforce this recalibration, and almost no one is taught to spot either one while it's happening. The first is the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to keep investing in something specifically because you've already invested so much, as though the years already spent would somehow be wasted rather than simply spent, regardless of what you decide next. The second is confirmation bias, which ensures that once you've decided this person is fundamentally good underneath it all, you begin unconsciously collecting evidence for that story and discounting everything that contradicts it. The same way a person convinced a stock will recover keeps holding it straight through the crash. Together, these two biases produce a strange kind of math. The worse a relationship gets, the harder it becomes to leave, precisely because leaving would mean admitting how much was already lost. This is not a character flaw. It is a well-documented feature of ordinary human cognition. And recognizing it, operating in your own mind, is often the first moment the entire dynamic starts to lose its grip. Here is where Stoic philosophy offers something startlingly practical. Centuries before modern psychology arrived at the same conclusion through laboratories instead of scrolls. Epictetus drew a hard line between what lies within your control and what doesn't. And toxic relationships are one of the clearest tests of that principle you will ever face. You cannot control whether a toxic person changes. You cannot control whether they eventually see what they've done. You cannot control the story they tell about you after you're gone. What remains entirely within your control is a single, narrower question. How much continued access does this person have to your time, your attention, your nervous system? Seneca went further, arguing that we should treat our remaining time as the scarce resource it actually is, and question, with real seriousness, why we spend so much of it on people who deplete rather than nourish us. The Stoics weren't advocating coldness. They were making a distinction most people never draw: caring about someone and remaining available to them are not the same obligation. And confusing the two is precisely how good people end up trapped for years in relationships that are actively harming them. The next realization changes everything, because it reframes what making someone disappear from your life actually requires. And it has almost nothing to do with confrontation. Most people imagine that removing a toxic person means a dramatic, final conversation. A moment of clarity where you finally say everything you've been holding back, and they finally understand the damage they've caused. This fantasy is almost entirely counterproductive, and behavioral psychology explains why. Confrontation with a person who has spent years benefiting from your accommodation rarely produces insight in them. It produces defense, escalation, or a fresh round of the exact intermittent reinforcement that kept you hooked in the first place. A sudden, convincing apology precisely engineered, whether consciously or not, to pull you back in. What actually works is far less cinematic and far more effective, consistent, unemotional reduction of access. Fewer replies, shorter replies, longer gaps before responding. No explanation offered, because an explanation is an invitation to negotiate. And negotiation is exactly the terrain on which manipulative dynamics thrive. This isn't cruelty. It's the psychological equivalent of a controlled burn, quiet, deliberate, and far more permanent than any single dramatic exit could ever be. Think about the last time you watched a habit fade. Not through willpower, but through simple, unglamorous non-repetition. A gym membership you stopped using. A show you stopped watching halfway through a season. A routine that simply stopped being fed. Relationships, even damaging ones, run on the same basic mechanism. They require maintenance, attention, and response to survive. And a person who has grown accustomed to a certain level of access will, in the overwhelming majority of cases, eventually redirect their energy elsewhere once that access consistently fails to deliver what it once did. This is not about winning or losing some invisible contest. It's simply how behavior extinguishes when the reinforcement that sustained it stops arriving. The version of you that keeps waiting for a clean, satisfying ending is often the same version still hoping somewhere beneath the surface that this person will finally become the person you always needed them to be. Viktor Frankl's insight, forged under circumstances almost no modern reader can fully imagine, adds something crucial here that pure strategy misses. Frankl observed that, even in conditions of total external powerlessness, one freedom remained entirely intact: the freedom to choose one's own attitude toward any given circumstance. Applied to a toxic relationship, this reframes the entire struggle. You may not be able to control when or whether this person exits your life gracefully. You may not be able to control the guilt that surfaces at 2 in the morning, questioning whether you're overreacting, whether you're the toxic one, whether you'll regret this in 5 years. But you retain complete authority over one thing: the meaning you assign to the space you create. That space can mean loneliness, or it can mean the first quiet room you've had in years that isn't secretly monitoring someone else's mood. The relationship doesn't get to decide which one it becomes. You do. This is where integration, the concept Jung considered essential to real psychological wholeness, becomes unexpectedly relevant to something as concrete as cutting someone off. Jung believed that growth doesn't come from eliminating the parts of experience that frighten you, but from consciously understanding them instead of being unconsciously ruled by them. Applied here, the work isn't simply removing the toxic person. It's examining, honestly and without self-punishment, exactly what pattern drew you toward them and kept you there. Because if that pattern remains unexamined, it doesn't disappear when the person does. It waits patiently for the next person who happens to speak its language. This is why so many people with genuine heartbreak and confusion find themselves cycling through different phases, attached to the same underlying dynamic, convinced each time that this one is different, until they finally recognize the pattern wasn't about any single person at all. Imagine, for a moment, actually sitting with the question of what your life looks like 6 months after this person has fully disappeared from it. Not the fantasy version, the dramatic goodbye, the vindication, the quiet, unremarkable version. An evening with nothing to brace for. A phone that doesn't make your stomach drop when it lights up. A version of you that has more available attention than you remembered having, because so much of it had been quietly rerouted toward managing someone else's unpredictability. That version of your life isn't a fantasy. It's simply what remains once the tax is removed. Most people never get to feel it, not because it's inaccessible, but because the guilt of wanting it feels itself like evidence of some character flaw. It isn't. Wanting your own nervous system back is not selfish. It is, if anything, the most basic form of self-respect available to a human being. None of this means the process will feel clean. Jung was clear that anything genuinely psychological rarely proceeds in a straight line. There will be a night, maybe several, where the old pull returns with startling force, where the intermittent reinforcement your brain once craved sends a phantom signal, where you almost reach for your phone before remembering why you shouldn't. That moment isn't failure. It's simply the old circuitry, still running its outdated programming, gradually losing its grip with each time you choose not to answer it. What changes first isn't the feeling. It's the response to the feeling. And that gap, small and unglamorous as it looks from the outside, is the entire difference between a person who stays entangled for another decade and a person who finally, quietly, walks free. And this leaves you with the only question that actually matters. The one no boundary script or confrontation fantasy can answer for you. If the hardest part of removing a toxic person was never really about them, if it was always about the part of you that learned, long before you could even name it, to mistake chaos for connection, then what exactly are you protecting by staying? And who might you finally become in the silence you've been so afraid to let yourself have? If this kind of psychology, the kind that looks past the obvious explanation and finds the real one underneath, is something you want more of, consider staying close. There's more of this coming, built for people who'd rather understand the pattern than keep repeating it.